The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, thank you for joining us today. My name is Jean-Guy Bourgeois. I'm the Director of Internal Operations at the Manitoba Government and General Employees Union. I will be moderating today's webinar from Winnipeg. Before we get going, before I introduce today's session, I have a few housekeeping items. First, you should be able to both hear me and see the PowerPoint presentations during the webinar. 2, if you need assistance with your connection, please dial 1-855-352-9002, then press number 1, then press number 1 again, and then once again. This will bring you to a customer service agent who can help you connect. 3, after the presentation, we will open the floor to questions for the presenters. Questions can be submitted by typing your question in the question area of the control panel in front of you. 4, at the end of the session, I will read any questions that have been submitted for our presenters to answer. 5, if for any reason we cannot answer your question during this session or we run out of time, please contact info@share.ca, that's info@share.ca, and we will make sure your questions get answered. Finally, we have scheduled 1 hour for the webinar. Now I will introduce you to today's presenters. First, we have Sherry Harty, a benefits counselor at the Ontario Public Service Employees Union with 15 years in the pension industry. She works with and for members of pension plans on a daily basis by sitting on 2 pension committees, boards of trustees, to ensure that the pension promise is met and that members can retire with dignity. In addition, she also supports bargaining teams who are members of all sorts of different pension plans by ensuring the information they are being given by the employer and/or actuary is a true representation of the plan. We also have Lori Hutchinson, a retired pension actuary who spent more than 25 years specializing in defined benefit pension plans. Her career has been primarily in Ontario, working at a large pension consulting firm, the Provincial Pension Regulator, and 2 of the province's largest public sector pension plans. Lori currently serves as a director for the OMERS Administration Corporation. Now I'm going to turn things over to Lori and Sherry, who will have the PowerPoint ready on their screen. Lori, Sherry?
Thank you very much for joining us today. I am Sherry Harty, and with me is Lori Hutchinson, and you've heard our short biographies. So we welcome you to this web series. Thank you very much for attending. The objective today really is to explain the funding of pension plans and what the role of the actuary is. So as an introduction, during the last webinar, you learned about the retirement schemes here in Canada. One of those schemes is a defined benefit pension plan, and also known as DB. You'll remember that from the last session that a defined benefit pension plan is the type of pension plan where your benefit is defined. Of course, that's how the name came about. And what that actually means is the monthly lifetime pension is known all through your working career. We're going to focus on the defined benefit pension plan during this session, and there are a number of different types of defined benefit pension plan. The one that we'll be focusing on really though is probably the one that most of you will be familiar with, would be the final average earnings pension plan. This type of pension plan has a pension that's based on your years of service in the plan, as well as your retirement or your earnings right before retirement. Normally, you'll see the earnings be averaged over a period of 3 to 5 years. So that does fluctuate from plan to plan. There are other types of plans out there, but those will have different funding implications because of the earnings period. So before we get started, we're going to give you a hypothetical example. That is that there's 3 different pension plans, but they have the same plan design, the same type of membership, as well as the same type of assets. They go to the same actuary for a funding valuation, but they have 3 different plan sponsors. Their funding valuations all have the same date as December the 31st, 2015. What comes out of those valuations, though, is our different answers. The first plan from plan sponsor A is only 95% funded, and the contribution rate is set at 16% of earnings. The second plan, Plan B, is 105% funded, with contributions being set at 12% of earnings. And the third plan, Plan C, is 102% funded, contributions set at 10% earnings. Again, it's important to remember that the plan design, membership, and assets, as well as the plan actuary, are all the same. So the questions really come is how could 3 different sponsors with the same plan, having the same characteristics with the same actuaries, actually have different results? Can that happen? And also, can you tell which plan's funding is actually better, given that there's different contribution rates? So we'll leave those questions with you at this point, and we'll come back to them in about 40 minutes after at the end of our presentation. So our agenda for today is first we're going to go over pension funding concepts. We'll look at funding valuations and the role of the actuary in them, as well as the methods and assumptions that are used in the funding valuation. We'll look at funding decisions, again, look at how the actuary plays a role, how to read a valuation report, then we'll go to a summary and go back to our hypothetical example. So you probably remember this slide from the last webinar. It's a common slide that you see often when you talk about defined benefit pension plans. So basically what you're looking at is how money goes into the plan and how it flows out of the plan. At the top, you can see that there's contributions going into the sink, we'll call it. Those contributions are invested, of course, and those investments ideally will have returns that go back into the plan. Out of the plan, so flowing out of the bottom of your sink, are the expenses to keep the plan running, and of course, most importantly, the benefits that are being paid to members and pensioners. So what's important to remember is that the contributions that plan members make plus the investment earnings have to equal the benefits that are paid out plus the expenses. So most Canadian public sector defined benefit pension plans are pre-funded, and what that actually means is that contributions go into the plan as benefits are earned. So it's not that contributions go into the plan when they're needed to be paid out, it's that they're funded before the benefits are paid out. When a plan is pre-funded, the contributions are considered tax deductible and invested, and the investment earnings are tax-free as well. The advantages, of course, are greater benefit security, and typically you see that the investment earnings actually pay for 65 to 80% of the plan cost. So that means that for every dollar that's paid out of the pension plan, only 20 to 35% actually comes from contributions. The rest comes from the investment earnings. So really then, what we're looking at is how much does it cost to provide that pension, and that will depend on each individual member in the pension plan. It'll depend on their time in the plan, how much service they have, what their earnings level are, and in our particular case, what's the most important period for earnings, of course, is immediate pre-retirement earnings. Of course, what also matters is how long they're receiving a pension. And there's other things that matter as well. For example, if somebody has a spouse and is providing a survivor's pension to that spouse, there's inflation and other options that are there as well. All of those things matter and go into how much it costs to provide that person's pension. So then the question becomes, well then how can we provide that pension and know how much it's going to cost if we don't know all of these things? For example, we have no idea how long a pensioner is going to live. In addition to that, we really don't know how well our investments are going to do as well. So how can we determine how much we need in contributions in advance, and how are we going to know how much investment earnings we're going to get to pay that pension that we've promised people? And the answer to that is a funding valuation. So there are a number of different valuations, and we're going to be talking about a going concern funding valuation. The other types of valuations are accounting, wind-up, solvency, but the way those funding valuations are done, all of the assumptions are very prescriptive and are prescribed in advance. The funding valuation, however, doesn't have the same highly prescriptive regime. And so I'm going to turn it over to Lori now to talk about the funding valuation and all of the information from here on out.
Great. Thanks, Sherry. The first question is, what is a funding valuation? And essentially what Sherry was alluding to is that it's a measurement of the financial position of the plan at a single point in time. So what you do is you take a look at where your membership is and where your assets are currently, and then you compare that to where you think the value of your liabilities, which is the value of all the benefits that are going to be provided to members of the plan on that same date. And as Sherry indicated, when you don't know exactly what those benefits will be, you need to make some assumptions. And that's what we're going to spend some time on for the next 20 minutes or so, talking about, well, how do you go about doing that point-in-time financial assessment? And it requires valuation assumptions and methods, okay? Once you've calculated the value of your assets and the calculation of the value of those benefits, which we term as liabilities, you can then look at the overall funded status of the plan. If your assets are greater than your liabilities, then you have a surplus. Contrary to that, if your assets fall short of your liabilities, you have what's known as a funding deficit. And your funded status will greatly influence how you set your contribution rates going forward. The valuation also includes another critical component, which is, because it's a point-in-time financial assessment, it also compares to the prior valuation results. So you can see how well are your estimates doing against the actual experience of the plan. And then you can make any adjustments if necessary going forward to make sure that you have sufficiency in those contributions and investment earnings, and therefore that translates into benefit security as well. The valuation does not set the contribution rates per se. It's a tool and a measurement that, with other tools, which we'll also talk about later in the presentation, provide enough information for the key decision makers to set contribution rates going forward. And then the next time you do a funding valuation, you revisit your current contribution rates and determine their sufficiency going forward. The valuation itself is, although it's not completely prescriptive, there are a lot of rules and laws that go into it. And what it will do is those rules and laws will provide a range of permissible contributions from the date of the valuation until the next valuation date. And then depending on where the decision is made between those ranges, that's where you come up with the resetting, if necessary, of your contribution rate. The legal requirements that I referred to are both federal and provincial. The federal law, which is the Income Tax Act, limits the maximum amount of permissible contributions. Recall Sherry indicated that they're tax deductible, so of course the tax agency wants to have some control over the amount of those contributions that are going into the plan on a tax sheltered basis, because as well the investment earnings accrues on a tax-free basis. The pension laws, which are usually under provincial jurisdiction, prescribe the minimum required contribution. So they're more focused on the security of the benefits provided, and as well recognize any of the professional requirements in conducting these. The actuarial standards, which is the professional body guiding the pension actuaries, also provides rules and guidelines for valuations in terms of their acceptability. So although we will get into the presentation, there is a fair amount of discretion in evaluation, it still is subject to some pretty complex rules and guidelines. So the next question begs then, how do you do evaluation with all of these requirements and complexities? The answer is the plan actuary. The plan actuary is usually a fellow of the Canadian Institute of Actuaries. They are a pension plan expert who has knowledge of pension and related laws and rules, as well as their own professional standards. Their exposure to pensions and the industry is broad, often international, and they have a lot of experience working with different pension plans, different experiences, different objectives and guidelines, as well as emerging trends, which can influence the valuation results as well as the plan sponsors' overall management of the plan. They're experts in financial risk measurement and assessment, which is why you would want to use their skills and experience in setting assumptions, talking about assumption methods, as well as what the valuation results actually mean to date and going forward. They serve as an advisor to both plan sponsors and plan administrators. And we'll spend just a minute talking about what exactly do those terms mean. The plan sponsor is typically the employer or a board of trustees. And what they do is they actually decide whether or not to provide the plan in the first place. They also design the benefits that are provided under the plan and have the authority to change those benefits subject to the constraints provided under pension law. On the other hand, the plan administrator is the body that manages and operates the plan and also is responsible for things such as the valuation of the plan. Typically, this can be the plan sponsor, and if not the plan sponsor, it's often a pension committee or a board of trustees. So getting back to the plan actuary, they use their expertise and knowledge to provide a very important role in the valuation. And what we'll do is we'll talk about first what they are responsible for, and then we'll get into, as the dialogue continues, what they are actually not responsible for and who is. What the plan actuary does initially is they will, before we can actually conduct the valuation, you need to make some determination of key input items. These input items are the valuation methods and the valuation assumptions that will be used in the point-in-time valuation. The actuary will conduct periodic assumption reviews to make sure they remain relevant to the purposes of the plan and appropriate for the valuation. And then they will make recommendations about what they feel are the most appropriate valuation methods assumptions for the particular plan. They also prepare the valuations and other financial forecasts as requested, and they'll determine as part of that valuation the minimum and maximum funding requirements that we talked about that are bound by provincial and federal legislation. And that, in turn, is used by the plan sponsor to set the contribution rates going forward. Now, in addition to performing the valuation, also plan actuaries are also involved in helping clients develop their funding goals, their funding policies and investment policies, all of which support the overall management of the pension plan. In terms of the valuation methods and assumptions, as we mentioned before, they make recommendations, but the plan actuary does not actually have the final decision on those methods and assumptions. They'll conduct the reviews and they'll make recommendations for what is appropriate for the current valuation, but it's the plan administrator that has final approval of the actuarial valuation methods and assumptions. So if you are a trustee on a board of trustees that is the capital A administrator of your pension plan, it's not the actuary who has the final decision on those assumptions and methods. It's actually the board of trustees itself. And that's a key distinction because, as with any tool that provides calculations, it's really the input that drives the output. And so methods and assumptions are very, very important, and that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time on going forward. Valuation methods are used for both the assets and the liabilities, or the present value of benefits. The methods used do not vary often, but it's important as the administrator to understand them, and it's also okay to ask, why are you using particular assumptions valuation methods for assets and liabilities? And the correct answer is not because everyone else does or because we always have, but you'll be surprised at how many times those kinds of answers can find their way in a boardroom. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on these, but just to be aware, we only have an hour, and you could spend an hour just on this slide. But just to know that they exist, and like I said, it's important to ask why you use a particular method, and then it'll be the responsibility of the person providing the answer to explain a little bit about these methods. On the asset side, most plans use what they call as a smoothing technique. And that's because you don't want a whole lot of volatility on your asset value between valuations, which could end up greatly impacting your minimum and maximum contribution range. So what they do, and what is completely acceptable, is to introduce a smoothing technique to the assets. And the smoothing method does is it essentially spreads the gains and losses of investment that are occurring over a period of years, often 5 years. And again, like I said, what you'll find is that your smoothed asset value from valuation to valuation is actually a lot more like a rounded curve versus the spikes of peaks and valleys you might see in year-to-year valuations if you were not to use the smoothing method. On the actuarial cost method for determining liabilities, there's two methods that are the most common, the projected unit credit and the modified aggregate method. They are both acceptable to the regulators and the actuarial profession. One is much more prevalently used than another, but it doesn't mean it's more correct. Again, the important thing for a trustee or a plan administrator is to ask, why are you using the current method? In respect of valuation assumptions, there are many. What you need to do is, as Sherry indicated, with the cost of the benefits, you need to estimate things like when do the members join the plan? How long are they in the plan? Why do they leave the plan? How much did they contribute while they were in the plan? How much did they earn? What type of benefit did they elect? How long will you have to pay that pension benefit? There's a great deal of questions that need to be answered before you can actually place a dollar amount beside the value of a pension benefit, and it's the assumptions that drive this output. So they're used to estimate the present value of future benefit payments that the pensioners will receive, as well as the terminated members and members on disability and et cetera. Many of the assumptions tend not to vary from valuation to valuation, although they are reviewed with frequency. Today we're going to focus on the most material ones. We don't have enough time to go through every single assumption, but we will focus on discount rate, longevity, when people die, the date at which you retire, your earnings level, especially pre-retirement, as well as people who leave the plan before they reach retirement age. We're going to start with the discount rate because it's the most significant assumption. If you only want to focus on understanding one assumption that goes into the valuation, this is the one. The discount rate is used to value the liabilities because it determines the present value today of future benefits payments. It reflects both the long-term investment outlook, but it also needs to reflect the plan's funding policy, how they're investing the contributions and the plan assets, as well as what types of investments are they putting the contributions in the plan assets in. Collectively, you'll come up with an assumed real rate of return, and then you add an inflation assumption to come up with the nominal discount rate. More importantly, or as importantly as the assumed future investment return for plan assets is you'll also see that there is a margin included in the discount rate. And that margin is used to protect the plan against adverse experience on the investment side, which must meet legal and actuarial standards. When you include a margin in the discount rate goes down. And as the real discount rate decreases, the liabilities or the present value of future benefits will increase, which means your liabilities go up while your asset value doesn't change much, and so your funding ratio decreases. And remember that funding ratio is very important in setting contribution rates. So if you've got your liabilities going up and your assets not going up as quickly, it can lead to a lower funded position and even a funding deficit. Valuation results are very sensitive to changes in this real discount rate. For example, a 1% decrease in the real discount rate, so you've got a discount rate of, let's say, a real discount rate of 4%. If you drop that down to 3%, your liabilities can go up as much as 20% for one valuation. And your normal cost, which is the cost of benefits being earned in the next year, can go up by as much as 25%. Okay, this is a very, very important assumption in the valuations, and often you'll see that it's the one that drives your range of contributions that arise out of the valuation. There are other important assumptions, though. It's not just about the discount rate. If you've read about pensions or retirement in newspapers lately, there's been a lot of discussion about longevity. Longevity is how long do people live. Mortality is another name for it, and it's a key assumption for the valuation, because once pensions are in pay, the main cost driver is how many payments is each member going to receive. And the longer each member lives, it's great for the member, but it actually is more expensive for the pension plan. In recent years, as I mentioned, you've heard a lot about longevity in the news, and that's because people are living longer now than they used to 20, 30 years ago. And what that's done is taken plans that were funded for years and all of a sudden seen material increases in the cost of these defined benefit plans, because remember, it plays a lifetime pension plan. So the commitment to pay the number of pensions has not changed, but the actual number of pensions has gone up versus previous decades. And that has increased the cost of these pension arrangements. How do we determine future death rates? Well, again, we turn to the actuarial profession, and they produce mortality tables, and they periodically update those mortalities, which they did recently, and caused a lot of plans filing valuations in the last 12 months to recognize these new tables, and so these plans saw an increase in their liabilities in the last period. So it's not just discount rate that can affect contribution rates. Longevity is quite important. And the last thing is that if a plan is large enough, which a lot of these public sector plans are, they'll have sufficient experience within their own plan that they can take these actuarial tables that are available and customize them so that they better reflect their own plan's mortality experience. Another assumption that's important for a defined benefit pension plan is retirement rates. We need to estimate when active members are actually going to retire and start collecting their pension. And each plan will have specific rates for their valuations, because it's important. If you've got one plan that provides unreduced retirement at age 65 and another plan that provides unreduced retirement at age 62, the retirement experience between those two plans will probably be different. And so you need to take your plan's plan design and anticipated member behavior and reflect that, as well as looking at historical experience within your plan. Think about projected member behaviors and determine plan-specific rates in order to do your valuation. And these tables, they don't have to be age-related only. If you have provisions in the plan that allow you to retire unreduced at 30 years of service, you may want your retirement rates to reflect that 30-year target somehow. There's also plans that provide unreduced retirement at a a certain number of points are achieved under the plan, which are usually a combination of age and service, 80 points being a common one in some of these plans. Again, if you've got an unreduced benefit where members achieve that certain milestone, you might want your retirement rates to reflect that milestone. The other thing is that in addition to unreduced ages in your plan design, you can also have ages that you retire before you reach the unreduced, where you have a reduction for starting it before you reach the unreduced age. And that can vary by plan design. It's up to the plan sponsor to decide how much. To the extent that it's more expensive for the plan, even though the member's receiving a smaller benefit, it's a higher value and therefore higher cost to the plan. To the extent that those benefits are included in the plan design, you should also try to capture that behavior in your retirement rates. So again, it can be fairly complex, and the plan administrators and plan sponsors can look to their plan actuaries to help them in developing these retirement assumptions. We said earlier that we were going to be talking about final average earnings plans, and in these plans the earnings growth assumption is also quite important, because what you're doing is you are setting contributions today for members whose benefits will be determined ultimately on their earnings level closer to their retirement dates. So you need assumptions that track the earnings level of members going through their membership. It's also important where you have a contributory plan where the members contribute as well, because you need to be able to calculate how much are those contributions going to be in the future. And to do that as a percentage of earnings, you need to know what are those earnings levels going to be. Again, they tend to be plan specific, not necessarily to the plan design, but to the plan demographics, which is what do your members look like, and what do we expect the earnings growth for your plan's membership to be going forward. You reflect the merit and promotion that is typical. You reflect collective bargaining that is included amongst your membership. And as well, just general knowledge of average wage trends is an important influencer in determining the earnings growth. Again, depending on the characteristics of the plan, your plan may be more or less sensitive to the earnings assumption, but it is important for all defined benefit final average earnings pension plans. And the last assumption we're going to go into detail about today is withdrawal rates. We need to reflect that some members will actually leave the plan before they reach their retirement age. And if they do, they can either, if they're eligible for a deferred pension, they can leave that pension in the plan and collect it at retirement, or they can take it out in a lump sum. Both of those have funding implications for the plan, and because we need to we are aware that this will happen in the plan, you need an assumption, both in terms of how many members will not stay in the plan until retirement, and for those that do not, what decision do they make in terms of leaving their money in the plan or until retirement or taking it out in a lump sum. Valuation assumptions are key input items to the valuation, which drives your contribution rates. But as you know, they are assumptions. And what every actuary will tell you is that we will always be wrong. We like to be close, but we will be wrong. Actual experience will not be exactly the same as that assumed. And to the extent that it's different, you find that your experience gains and losses for the valuation period emerge because you either thought it was going to be more expensive or less expensive than it actually turned out to be. And that too can affect the plan status as you basically correct your steering of your funding with the provision of the next valuation report. Other than the margin that I talked about that's in the discount rate, you generally expect gains and losses to offset each other over time. As a whole, you expect them to offset each other, and even the individual assumptions themselves, you'll find that the intent is usually to be the best estimate of future long-term experience. So you wouldn't expect to see a very large difference or experience gain or loss in either direction for the assumptions from valuation to valuation. However, it does occur. Periodic assumption reviews are conducted, and what they do is they will look at the experience over time as well as what's the future trending toward. And to the extent that there's material differences to what is currently in the assumptions, there will be recommendations from the plan actuary to adjust the assumptions so that they're more in line with that experience as well as the future outlook. But again, the trends that you see in the valuation report, even though the periodic assumption reviews are scheduled, usually set in a particular time frame every 3 to 5 years, for example, a result in a particular valuation of an experience gain or loss can actually trigger a review at that time. Just a quick example as how the valuation assumptions produce experience gains and loss in the valuation. Let's look at the discount rate. Okay? If the actual investment return for the valuation period was higher than the assumed discount rate, then what you'll see is you'll see an experience gain in your funded status. Okay? And so that could lead to a reduction in contributions or a greater funded ratio. Okay? On the other hand, if people are retiring later than you assume them to be, then they might actually be working past the most expensive age that provides benefits under the plan. In that case, the plan would also see a gain. However, if a lot of members are taking advantage of those subsidized early retirement benefits, even more members than you had assumed in the valuation, then you'll see a loss to the plan. So as you can see, the differences in the experience gains and losses reflect how the valuation assumptions were different from the experience of the plan itself during that valuation period. Now, before we talk more about the valuation itself, I'm just going to pause here and say, how does the valuation fit in terms of setting contribution rates? Because I'd said earlier that the valuation produces a range of contributions. Well, how do you actually set the contribution rates themselves then? So it's the plan sponsor who determines contribution rates. And after designing the plan, typically a plan sponsor will determine its funding goals. And the funding goals are entirely unique to that sponsor. They can be contributions, volatility want to be minimized. In other words, you want to be able to keep your contribution rate the same for as long as possible. And if there are adjustments that need to be made to the contribution rates, you want them to be very small. Some people may have the #1 priority or goal is maximizing security of promised benefits. And in that case, they will ensure that the benefits promised are the benefits that are received. And for that rate, they may be less worried about increases to contribution rates as long as benefits are preserved and secure. Another type of goal that they might have is intergenerational equity. In other words, we don't want the future members having to pay a lot more for the plan, the same benefit. Or we don't want our future members having to receive fewer benefits than the current generation of members because of changes in funding status. Okay? You can see that there are a lot of similarities in the goals, but there are times when they're actually contradictory. So it's the balancing of whatever goals the plan sponsor has that helps them determine and set contribution rates, as well as other decisions in terms of funding. Once they have these goals, okay, they know that there are risks to achieving them. We've already talked about longevity and the fact that with pensioners living longer, it's a lot more expensive to provide a benefit, the same monthly amount of retirement benefit to a 65-year-old today than it was to provide to a 65-year-old in 1980. As well, we all know that it's a challenging investment environment out there. There's low interest rates, slow growth, a lot of volatility. All of that produces overall outlooks for lower returns on the plan assets, as well as a lot of volatility. So we talked about managing that volatility with the asset smoothing method, and we also talked about the volatility, or sorry, the level of plan return paying for 65 to 80% of the benefits. That may be difficult going forward. Okay. Other risks are plan maturity and political, regulatory, and actuarial. There are techniques to help manage these risks, and we talked about them. Asset smoothing, margins, contribution rates. They can pay more than the minimum and establish reserves. And as well, there are rules about how often you have to file a valuation, and there's a little bit of wiggle room in those rules. That is another tool to help manage these funding risks. The plan sponsor also has a funding policy, which is a framework to achieve these funding goals. It articulates a whole lot of things about what need to be the plan sponsor and the plan administrator have to be mindful of in terms of being able to achieve their funding goals. I'm not going to get into these today. It's just there so that you are aware of what they are. The funding goals and the funding policy are then incorporated into the plan's investment policy, which we're going to talk about in the next webinar. Together, all of these things are reflected in the choice of the discount rate assumption used in the valuation and are used by the plan sponsor to set contribution rates, benefits, and determine when to file valuation. So getting back to the plan actuary, in terms of funding decisions, the plan actuary does not have the final decision on contribution rates. They do not set the rates. They perform the valuation and determine the range and make sure everything adheres to laws and actuarial standards. It's the plan sponsor who uses the valuation and the goals and policies to set the rates and adjust benefits if necessary. Now I'm going to turn it over to Sherry, who's going to go through aspects of reading a valuation, what's in the valuation report, what's to look for, okay, and where you might have questions in terms of the valuation itself.
Okay, so a lot of the information that you've been given so far has been given by Lori, who, as you know, is a retired actuary. I, of course, sit on a pension committee as well as a board of trustees. In addition to that, I read valuations from the perspective of what our plan members, what are the risks our plan members have. And so I also have experience reading a valuation from the perspective of bargaining. So these are kind of the things that you want to look for when you're looking at a valuation. You want to look at what's changed since the prior evaluation. Has there been a change in plan design, the methods, the assumptions, the rules or guidelines? Have we changed the plan actuary? That can actually be a red flag. Also, it's good to know what the external environment is like. Has the investment market tanked? Are there political things that are happening? All of those will go into how things have changed in our evaluation, but also what things to take into consideration. And all of them will impact the results. So, and even if those things that have changed actually offset each other, it's important to actually look at them and be aware of them. So what you actually want to look at, and probably the most important thing, in my opinion, are the methods and assumptions that have been used. Particularly if they've changed, you look at when was the last time that they were actually reviewed. For example, if we're looking at a retirement rate and how when people are retiring, has that assumption actually changed in, say, the last 20 years? Because things have changed over the last 20 years, it's unlikely that the retirement rate has actually stayed the same. So you'll want to ask the question, has this been reviewed? If not, why not? You also really, and I think Lori talked about this, is look at the discount rate. This is the one assumption that has such a huge impact on the funding of the plan. So this is the one assumption. Again, if it's the only thing that you take out of this presentation, this is the one assumption that you want to look at very, very closely. You want to ask a ton of questions about how this, the discount rate was arrived at. Is there a margin for adverse deviation? If there's not, why not? If there is, how much is that margin? Why is the margin so low? Why is it so high? because it's so sensitive to change, you want to ask these questions. You also want to see if there's a difference in the margin for adverse deviation to the prior valuation. If it's not the same as the last valuation, you want to ask why it's different. And it's important to remember that the lower the discount rate means the more there's conservatism, which means the liabilities or the cost of providing the benefit is higher. So other things to look at is the reconciliation of plan membership. Has there been a large membership activity since the last report? Is your plan growing? Is it stable? Is it shrinking? Why are these things happening? Why that matters is because if the membership is growing, that's probably a good thing. It means that there's probably a little bit less risk. If it's shrinking, that's a huge problem. You want to ask why that's happening. Is there anything that you can do to counteract that? You also want to look at the proportion of active contributing members versus others. Particularly, and usually the others are usually the pensioners. That's the largest other group. So you want to look at the ratio between those. The lower the ratio, the higher the risk, because that means that, for example, if the ratio is 1 contributing member to 1 pensioner, that means that there's less contributing members, or there's only 1 contributing member to 1 pensioner, and that can be a real risk. You want to look at your statistics as well. So you want to look for emerging trends in the active or inactive group. For example, is the average age of your contributing member getting higher? That means that you're probably have less years of contributing to the plan, which can impact the risks that you're seeing in your plan. So you want to look at the age and service distribution chart. I recognize that there's a lot of numbers in these charts, so it might not be the most fun information, but it holds a lot of important information, so you'll want to look at that. You'll also want to look, of course, at the plan assets. You want to look at the reconciliation. Does it align to the investment policy? How does it compare to the external investment market? You want to look at the pension cash flow. What that means is look at how much contributions are coming into the plan versus how much benefits are going out of the plan, particularly to the pensioners, but everyone. If the cash flow is negative, that means the contributions that are coming into the plan are not actually paying for all of the benefits that are going out. And so that just indicates risk. It's not necessarily that that's bad per se, it's just a risk. And so it's an area of question that you'll want to talk about with your fellow trustees, to the actuary, to how to mitigate or manage that risk. You'll also want to look at, of course, at the performance. Is it higher or lower than the assumed discount rate? And both is something that you want to question, particularly if the difference is large. You'll want to look at trends where the investment market is likely to go. It's, again, just something you want to question. So the gains and losses can also lead to a lot of questions. Lots of information here, and you have to recognize that what you're looking at. And so the chart that Lori showed earlier was super helpful, because you'll know if you have a gain in one area, what that actually means. So you'll want to compare the actual experience versus the assumption that was made during the last valuation. Is there a huge, was there a huge gain or loss? If it was quite a large one, then it's something that you might want to look at, ask questions about. Again, it might not be something necessarily that is incorrect, but it is something that you want to look at, and then look at trends. You'll also want to look at the contribution decisions in respect to surplus and reserve deficit, but you do want to look at the gains and losses over time. So are we seeing a gain in this particular assumption every single year? If so, then perhaps it needs to be reviewed. If it's just a gain this year, particularly if it's a small gain or a small loss, then you may just need to let it go. But it's a trend that you're really wanting to question. And of course, this is kind of, while it's certainly important, this is basically the output that you get from the valuation is what is the funded position. So you want to look at the assets. Have they been smooth? And is that impact actually negative or positive? If the impact is negative, then that means that actually there's probably a little bit of reserve there, and that's okay. If the impact is positive, it means that in the future, you're likely going to see your funded ratio probably go down. The liabilities, you want to look at the active to inactive ratio again, any trends. You want to look at the funded status. Are we in surplus? Are we in deficit? What's that ratio? Look at the reconciliation. And of course, you want to look at the contributions. You want to look at the minimum that's required under legislation, and also look at the maximum. So often you're not even going to be, especially in this environment, frankly, you're likely going to be at the maximum, but you'll want to look particularly at the minimum. Are we only making the minimum contributions? And if so, why is that? Or are we somewhere in between? Ask the question about that, and ask the question why. So for a summary, basically the funding is guided by the funding goals as well as the policy. Of course, the investment policy is important as well. It's important to remember that the plan is a valuation. The plan valuation is at a point in time estimate of the financial position of the plan. What's important here is the valuation methods and assumptions, especially the discount rate, are key, and they're only recommended by the plan actuary. The plan administrator has the final decision on the assumptions and methods. The plan actuary performs the funding valuation and determines what the contribution range, but the plan sponsor and/or the plan administrator actually sets the contribution rates and adjusts those benefits. Of course, those are guided by the funding goals and the policies. What's really important is to take away from this is the wealth of information that the valuation has. There's a ton of numbers, and I get that, and you know it might help you go to sleep at night, but it's so important. What's really important is to come away with a ton of questions to ask the sponsor and/or the actuary, and to review the financial status, the use of margins, the reserves, and especially the changes since the last report. And again, if there's one thing you want to question, it's that discount rate. Hopefully the valuation report will provide you with answers, and again, it should prompt a lot of questions.
So just quickly, we'll go back to the hypothetical example that we had at the beginning of the presentation, and essentially it was 3 plans, same design, assets and membership, and plan actuary. They all did their December 31st, 2015 funding valuation and came up with different funded ratios, and all 3 plans now have different contribution rates. Question number 1, is this possible? Simple answer is yes. One of the takeaways from today is it's not the actuary that determines the valuation methods and assumptions and the contribution rates. It's the plan sponsors and the plan administrators. Their goals and funding and investment policies will influence the choice of the assumptions as well as the decisions about what they actually have to do with the results of the valuation in respect of contributions and benefits. Second question, can you tell which plan's funding is better? No, you can't. Funding success depends on the probability of achieving the plan's funding goals. And in the absence of knowing what the goals are for these 3 plans, or being able to see their complete funding policies, investment policies, and the full actuarial valuation, you can't actually state a position in respect to this question. So the purpose of this example was to demonstrate that one should be careful not to jump to conclusion that higher funded status or lower contribution rates means the plan's funding is better than another's. The valuation assumptions, methods may be different, and or the plan's funding goals may not be the same. And now we'd like to turn it over to Jean-Guy.
Thank you very much, Lori and Sherry. We have a few minutes left for questions from our attendees. I have one question here from Hugues Letourneau. The question is, what factors go into the determination of a discount rate? How sensitive are discount rates to the key rate set by the Canadian Central Bank and rates set by the U.S. Federal Reserve?
Do we move on? Yes. Hi, it's Lori. I'll take that. In terms of the discount rate for the pension plan, it really is supposed to be reflective of the expected future return of the plan assets. To the extent that people choose to put more margin in their discount rates, they can use other external benchmarks as well. Okay, so that would get to the other indicators. I don't have them in front of me that was mentioned. I think one of them was bank rates and so forth. So the going concern valuation for a lot of plans, a lot of the defined benefit public sector plans in Canada anyway, are based on an assumed return that is related to the plan's asset mix, the expected return for the various asset classes within that asset mix, and then adding, doing a lot of testing and hypothetical testing using their plan actuary to find out what their particular plan performance would be in the global field of investments over a 20-year period with thousands and thousands and thousands of different simulations and different scenarios such as changes in inflation, interest rates, and so on and so forth. And using that information, they see where their plan return lies and then determine how much margin to put around that. You may see some plan administrators lean more towards an external benchmark, but it's either way is accepted under the profession.
And sorry, this is Sherry here, and maybe I'll just follow up with a question for Lori, kind of on that, is what would be considered normal in this type of environment? Are we talking a discount rate of 3%? Are we talking a discount rate of 5%, 10%? What would be considered probably within a reasonable discount rate?
The first thing I would say is I'm going to be talking about the real discount rate, which is net of inflation. And you'll see that in the Canadian public sector plans, typically that rate is somewhere between 2.9 and I would say 4.25%. If you go down to the States, you'll see that their discount rates are significantly larger. And despite that, their funded positions are also lower, which would be contrary to what you would think. So the Canadian system is actually in pretty good shape when you compare to its southern counterparts. But there has been a great deal of pressure in the States to get those discount rates lowered.
All right, we're running short on time now. There is one question that's just come in that I can give a quick answer to. The question is, can attendees get a PDF copy of this presentation? And the answer to that is yes. If anybody participating would like a PDF copy of the presentation, they can send a request to info, I-N-F-O, @share.ca, and a copy will be emailed to you. That is also true for any other questions or comments that any participants might have about today's webinar. Please email to info@share.ca. I would like to thank our presenters, Lori and Sherry, and all our participants for being here today. The next webinar in this series focuses on pension investment basics and will cover investment risks and opportunities, as well as the role of trustees in setting investment policy. If you would like to attend or find out more information, please go to the website at share.ca/NUPGE-webinars to register. Thank you again for joining us.